Hello and welcome. I'm Robbie Knock, and I'm the Director of Entrepreneurship and Professional Practice at ArtCenter College of Design. And thank you for joining us today. As with our webinars in the past, we've had an audience from all over the world, and we are very glad you're here with us, wherever you might be calling in from. And today, our goal is to help you understand the changing landscape in corporate innovation and the unique role that creatives are now playing leading this change. Entrepreneurship is widely considered to be a set of tools and practices most frequently associated with startups and new ventures. So what does it mean to bring these tools and practices into an existing organization? And why are creatives uniquely positioned to lead this type of work? Through our conversation today, we'll share personal strategies, collaboration processes, and leadership practices that propel this type of entrepreneurial innovation and transform organizations. Ultimately, our goal is to help you learn ways to apply this to your work wherever you might be in your career. And as with all of these webinars, we're grateful to have the support of our co-chairs, Yvette Roman and Robert Nashak. Thank you for their ongoing support. Overall, the Bold's mission is threefold: to educate artists and designers with business and entrepreneurship skills needed to succeed professionally, to enable artists and designers to articulate and convey the unique value that they bring to businesses and clients, and most importantly, Bold is here to help you start something new, to help you connect to that next stage in your career, to bring the strategy, tools, and network to do so, and to make sure ArtCenter is a part of your future success. So with that, just short introduction of our two guests before they share remarks about their work. We're very, very pleased to have Safir Bellali here. He has over 20 years of experience as an automotive engineer and an industrial designer. He's an alum of our transportation program at ArtCenter and also has an engineering degree from Mohammedia University in Morocco. As the head of innovation for Vans, Safir led the brand's digital transformation for 13 years and now oversees digital creation and innovation for VF Corporation overall. And for those of you that are not familiar, that includes Vans, North Face, Timberland, Dickies, and many, many others. Safir is a faculty member at USC and at ArtCenter, and he is an Aspen Institute First Mover Fellow. Joining Safir, we are really pleased to have Joshua Young. Joshua is also an alum of ArtCenter from the photography program and has had a remarkable career transforming digital creation and product design. Joshua spent 20 years leading Nike's 3D systems and design operations, and then launched his own firm and has worked as a consultant for brands including Patagonia, Lululemon, Calvin Klein, and many others. Joshua now works with Safir at VF, and together they are leading cross-disciplinary teams and innovation practices for the company and brands globally. So to start us off, Safir and Joshua are going to share a brief introduction of their work and professional practice. And you can choose who starts first. Maybe Safir, since you're always ready to go.
Thanks, Robbie, for the introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to to share our experience with alumni, students, and everyone else who's interested in this topic. As you mentioned, my background, my cultural background being between Morocco and Germany, but also my educational background between engineering and design has really led me to position myself squarely in that space in between. This is something that I've really recognized as an opportunity to make a difference, with the understanding that there are designers, there are engineers that are much better than I will ever be, right? But being able to understand both sides of the aisle, and really harness a solid understanding of what makes each function successful has led me to really focus quite a bit on empowering creators And this is something, you know, I joined VF as an organization about 16 years ago. As a designer, I led a design team that was focused on designing equipment for action sports, and then navigated the organization, ended up you know, leading innovation for Vans before transitioning into the global team at VF, the global innovation team at VF. You know, I've been involved in the organization's effort to transition into a more digitized product creation process. This is obviously something that at the scale of one company is already a big feat. And by the way, I wouldn't say that you know, the digital transformation of any organization is something that could take you know, any amount of time. I think it's a work in progress. But you know, together with Joshua, and I'm really excited, not only that Joshua is with me on this webinar, but that he's a partner in our journey in bringing digital product creation practices to the different brands at VF. And this is something that we do obviously with humility. You know, this is, you know, we're not coming in and saying this is how you should do things, but you know, there's a lot in the process that involves listening, really being in tune with the needs of the individuals, of the teams and the organizations, and doing our best to provide the environment and the technology that will help unlock meaningful outcomes.
That's brilliant. And Joshua, over to you, and coming from photography, how have you found your way into this world of products and innovation?
World. Yeah, that's a good question. And I guess when I left ArtCenter a very long time ago, and I'll just say it was the late 80s with a photography degree. You know, the focus of what I was trying to accomplish at that time was communicate using compelling images. So communicate ideas and products using really compelling images. As a photographer, that's sort of your job, right? At the time, the photography industry was dramatically changing. It was going through a change of digital transformation. We didn't call it that back then. It was just, hey, this cool digital photography stuff. But it was digital transformation. And so as I began to embrace that, a lot of other professionals were embracing that, and brands were embracing that. And so one of my early positions was starting at Nike back in the 90s, and they were moving from pen on paper to design on into designing on the computer. And so that transformation, I think, was difficult for a lot of creatives, a lot of people coming out of college. That how do you embrace these new technologies, and how do you move forward with them, and how do you embrace innovation? And so that we started working on that in the 90s, and then really quickly in the early 2000s started saying, why are we using, you know, traditional graphic design tools to design product that has dimension? And what is something different? How can we innovate in this space? And that began a journey literally in the year 2000 of looking at 3D simulation and design tools for apparel. Footwear had already been on this path, but we were, again, embracing it very early. And so through the mid 2000s, I started working in an innovation team, which we'll talk about a little bit more over the course of the conversation, about how do you build out a process where you can bring a product to market from concept to consumer all the way through the process in a fully digital go-to-market process, where you're communicating digitally rather than through pure physical products. And then in the late 2000s, started implementing those tools within Nike, and then later on, as you mentioned, some of these other brands. And I'm really happy to be working with Safir now at VF. We met in 2015, shortly after I left Nike, and at a trade show when I was speaking for the first time. I was a newbie in the conference world, and he helped me kind of understand kind of what does excellence in that area look like. And we've been partners in sort of collaboration, innovation ever since, and it's been a great journey.
Fantastic. So to start off, I guess from the really broadest perspective, what does innovation mean to you today? in the work that you're doing at VF?
Go ahead, Joshua.
Okay.
You're on the roll.
I think that's an excellent question. So I think if we look at where innovation has been, I've mentioned, starting within innovation in the mid 2000s. Here was this guy showing up into an innovation team at Nike, which was largely focused around, as many innovation teams in large brands, especially product brands, are around construction and material innovation. And here was this guy showing up with digital innovation. And at the time, and believe it or not, so it seems weird saying it now, is that a lot of people didn't know what digital innovation meant. What did it mean to use digital tools within the product process, within to express creativity, and to push the needle forward. And it was hard for me to see that you still had people who you would have thought be really innovative, be scared by what was basically something that was a new idea. And so I think that innovation isn't necessarily just about what tool you use or something that's new. I think the idea of innovation really evolves over time, and you have to, I think, really focus on are you doing something substantively different? Are you literally jumping to the next curve? So in other words, innovation isn't just about evolving slowly, doing something incrementally better. It's about taking large leaps. It's about reinventing the way you're doing something. And I don't want to oversell the work that we did early years with digital innovation as being, a large jump. But again, I think if you look where we are today, where most commerce happens digitally, where most design happens digitally, where a lot of our world around us is simply digitally focused. I mean, here we are. That was a leap, I think, at that time, even though it wasn't recognized as being traditional innovation. And so I think people need to keep their eye on the world for things that they might be nervous about, or that they might think are unfamiliar, and recognize sometimes that innovation isn't what they necessarily expect it to be.
So I absolutely, I totally agree with what you're saying, Joshua. In my perspective, like all good things in life, I feel that there's a textbook answer to this question, and then there's a real life practical answer based on your own experience. So I'll take a minute to maybe give both answers if that's okay. So the textbook answer, in my opinion, is that innovation is less about creating new products that satisfy a specific need. There's that quote that is often attributed to Henry Ford, although it doesn't sound like he actually said it, that says, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses, right? So innovation is less about finding these solutions to specific needs, but instead finding new ways to frame a challenge and solve really for the underlying cause that creates this need. So in this case, I think it's fair to quote our friends at Apple in saying that it's about thinking differently, right? So the practical answer is a bit more complicated, of course, right? And it takes me back to the time, I think this was about 6 years ago, when I was asked to start an innovation team at Vans. It was obviously, it was an amazing opportunity, a very humbling opportunity, because you had this this brand, this amazing brand with this amazing heritage, and this amazing history. And the challenge was really to understand what innovation means for a brand like Vans, right? Which had been around for almost 50 years with this amazing legacy. And so I spent quite a bit of time really trying to understand first where we came from, and also what really mattered to the followers, what mattered to the people who considered themselves part of the Vans family, and where we could take that in the future. And so where we landed was in deciding to commit to fueling the creation of innovative products and experiences. So it was not just about product, it was also about experiences that ultimately enable and inspire creative self-expression. That part about creative self-expression is the commitment, the mission of the brand itself. So it was more about empowering, enabling and empowering those inside of the company that would ultimately help the Vance family at large, express themselves creatively. So this, in my opinion, was a pretty big shift in my understanding of what innovation could do, shifting from creating amazing products and amazing experiences to creating platforms that would enable the co-creation of these amazing products and amazing experiences. And this is what led us, about 5 years ago, to pitch to the VF Innovation Fund the creation of a new type of customs experience for Vans. One that was more interactive, that enabled a lot more than the previous platform ever did. And it was really about understanding how we as a brand could put forth a platform that enabled that co-creation and that really empowered people out there to create themselves and be part of that creation effort. So that was, for me, that was a major shift in my understanding of what innovation could be.
Right, and that process of co-creation and that process of looking at the changing landscape of tools and technologies really requires you to work in between those existing pieces of the corporate infrastructure, the teams, the silos, the departments. Joshua, how has your work over the years been in that space in between, and how have you helped people bring new technology into that space?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think when, over the years when I started out, especially looking at some of the new ideas that we are coming up with at the time, I think I think that there's a temptation from people to think that if I have a good idea, it's simply going to sell itself. And that if I can present a neat idea, and if I can just walk people through it, people will get it and will be on board. And I think especially within a professional setting, you really have to stop and understand a lot of different things about how you get an innovation project started, how you build support, and how you move forward and how you express your innovation. So let's start with framing up your idea. First of all, and I think we'll talk a lot more about this, there's the aspect of storytelling. It can't just be the product speaks for itself. You have to be able to think of, for whatever your innovation is, how am I going to tell the story about this? How am I going to get people excited? How am I going to build a coalition, especially if you're internal, that speaks to people, that solves their problem? Depending upon what that innovation is, a lot of times a new innovation solves a particular problem, and people want that, right? People want to have problems that they have solved, and so you really have to understand, how can I express to them how this is going to make my life easier, how this is going to solve problems for me. I think a lot of people, and this was my problem with early VR projects, is that people thought, wow, VR is really cool. Let's make a dragon pop out of the floor or something like that. And that wasn't really solving a problem, right? It was neat, but it wasn't helping anyone actually do their job different. And I think I personally didn't see true innovation, at least in the corporate sense, around things like AR and VR until IKEA started putting together their, I forget exactly what it's called, but that ability to have an AR view of your home and be able to see how a furniture would actually fit inside your house, which, if you think about it, for IKEA, solves a massive problem. How can people, in a store that you have to go to shop in, how can they bring home a giant set of couches and see what they're going to look like in their house? And that's not an easy problem to solve, and it was a problem that was wholly solved by AR, that really could not be solved by any other method. So that was, I think, a really exciting, I think people were starting to understand this is the way that this really cool innovation, which didn't kind of previously have a really good place within a lot of different corporate environments, now can start solving problems for businesses. And so problem solving is number one. Storytelling, again, being number two. And then I think the other thing that we have to be aware of whenever you're in a corporate environment is the politics side of things. So you have to be able to navigate people's personalities. There will always be people who, either if you're coming up with something new, they immediately have to start thinking, how is this going to change the way this might change my job, or the things that I do, or even my position. And that's not a bad thing. People always want to be thinking about how their comfort or how they're going to do their job. And so the politics isn't necessarily a negative thing. It's just a natural human reaction. And so you have to be aware of that. You're not just, in the sense of a corporate environment where you're bringing in innovation forward, you're not just doing it for yourself. You're not just trying to create something new and shiny to burnish your personal image. You're having to bring an entire group of people together with you forward and bring the organization forward. They say a lot of times that a leader really should give solely credit to their team, because that is really what empowers you to continue doing innovation. And I think that a lot of times that if you're innovating in a corporate environment, even if you're the one, so quote unquote, with the big idea, you really need to release that to the people around you so that you can all succeed together.
Right, and that's one fundamental difference with the role internal at a corporation versus developing a new product or service outside as an entrepreneur. So Safir, the context is so important, right? And the evolving context of your conversations with different teams in different stages of the process. So tell us a little bit more about who you're working with, how those cross-functional partnerships have developed. What is it really like to be in a meeting room prior to launching the customs platform? Who is there, and how do you work with them?
So first of all, meetings, had a completely different feel back then. There was no screen in between you and your partners. But that aside,
we've been doing this forever now. It seems like it's fair.
Seems like it. But I think one of the big learnings from that experience specifically was that I realized that innovation could not happen in a silo, and I think there was a comment in the chat that touched upon that. Within an organization, if you're trying to innovate, you have to involve your key stakeholders, but also champions within the organization, because as an entrepreneur and a leader of change, you will make people uncomfortable, right? If you're asking people to do things differently, if you're innovating in terms of internal process or approaches, certain people, and it's absolutely understandable, have been doing their job really well a certain way, and are not comfortable changing just because someone came and said, I have a good idea. So it's important to find the champions within the organization, but also really understand what ultimately drives people, right? What's the underlying? It goes back to the essence of design and innovation, understanding the underlying motivation that brings people to work every day, and then that makes them commit to the success of a specific endeavor. So in terms of the practical example of the customs project at Advance, we had 14 different work streams that each involved representatives of pretty much every single department in the organization. If you think about innovating as an entrepreneur by yourself, it might be easier in the sense that you don't have to bring so many people along. You don't have to convince everyone. There's no real constraints and obstacles, structural and fundamental obstacles to overcome. But you're solely dependent on your own capabilities and your own abilities. And what I learned through that project specifically was that we had to rely on the strengths and the skills and the experience of many people to make this a successful project. And so I think I learned probably a lot more during the time that I was involved in that project than I did over my whole experience. Right.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, Safir. I think one of the things that at a certain point it's become almost second nature to me, but was very difficult at the very beginning of working in a brand is that, I guess when I was really early in my career, I really wanted to take all of the credit. Because you want to kind of puff yourself up and move forward in your career. And you don't really want to listen to what other people have to say about an idea that you have, because you've worked a lot hard on this thing and it's a great idea, and why isn't everyone just going to love it? But there's a lot of different opinions, and a lot of them very, very good, and people have been doing things oftentimes a lot longer than you have in these corporations and companies. And even if you're just working outside a corporation, working, as someone mentioned in the chat, if you're just working with a collaborative team, you're dealing with people from all sorts of backgrounds. And if there's one thing that is really important to teach people, especially in a collaborative environment, is that you have to be ready to listen to what other people say. That sort of yes and concept. Be ready to listen to what people say, and really analyze, is what they're saying better than, or is what they're not saying better? Is what they're saying valuable? And can it really add and change this idea and actually make it better? And I think that's sometimes it's hard to let go of something that that you've brought to the table and let it change and morph. But I think in a lot of ways that's the whole purpose of collaboration, is to really make something fine-tuned. I used to work with a gentleman who initially we did not like each other, but became one of my best friends in one of my previous roles. And he had the capacity to, and this was what was really annoying about him, he would immediately switch to the devil's advocate and find every single flaw in a concept, which you can imagine that might be rather annoying. But I realized it was one of the most valuable attributes that I could possibly find in a person, because they would help me refine my idea, or refine the group's idea, to the point where you literally could not poke a hole in it. You could not find a flaw with it. And it allowed us to go into meetings, and allowed us to go into presentations, and to be extremely confident with what we were trying to say, and know that we'd fully thought through this idea. And again, it was the sort of idea that would also lead us to new destinations, where we would take what was a good idea and actually make it into a fantastic idea, far beyond what it could have been, simply because we started asking questions about it, which is, I think, a great part of the collaborative process.
I think the idea of humility is really important, right? When you're trying to push innovative ideas through an organization or through society, you have to have quite a dose of humility to really understand at every point, at every decision that needs to be made, whether the decision you're making is the best one, and pressure test that against people who are a subject matter expert in that specific field. We're lucky because, you know, we work for an organization that makes product, you know, apparel, footwear, equipment, accessories. So failure is not necessarily going to result in death. You know, it's not like we're designing it for the medical industry, where innovating comes with a level of risk that for many would not be acceptable. However, there are business considerations that need to be taken into account. You know, and there was a very healthy tug of war happening at the very early stages of our conversations about the customs platform, which was, you know, we want to push the technology as much as possible, but at the same time, we want to be careful not to disrupt the business. We don't want to exclude people because of the technology that was involved, that was required to drive some of the more advanced aspects of this experience. And it was, I mean, it made a lot of sense, you know. As an innovator, I would love to push and make this experience amazing for everyone. But the reality is that we need to make some concessions, because there are people out there who might, you know, have, for instance, mobile devices that are 3 generations old, or, you know, computers that cannot handle technologies like WebGL, for instance. So this is the kind of discourse, and this is also another one that was really, to me, eye-opening, was the idea that as an organization, bringing the tools of co-creation to the public and allowing people to upload their own artwork and put it on shoes that had the Vans brand was a decision that we need to make, because as an organization, we were giving up on the creative control and creative control of the brand. You know, the people who wear your shoes are the ambassadors to your brand, you know, whether you want it or not. So if you let anything go on the shoes, you know, under the understanding that those are custom product with user generated content, are we as an organization committed enough to enabling and inspiring creative self-expression to the point that we're willing to give up on that creative control? And those were very healthy conversations, and it's you know, those are not conversations that you can have with yourself.
But it's a great example, though, because while I think it was a very risky thing in some ways, I think in the I don't think there's many brands that would have made that decision to allow consumers to put anything they want on their shoes, but it resulted in such, honestly, amazing stories. The story of Eric Repair, who put Anthony Bourdain's portrait on his shoes, is a legendary story. And it's, you know, it's a van story, and it's because of that wouldn't have happened unless you know, that they had taken that risk. And so I think sometimes you have to take risks as a brand in order to succeed, and those risks, I think, are great. Someone just mentioned Nike ID. Yeah, I think at first Nike was not altogether very sure about this idea of letting the average person, you know, create colorways and put them on their shoes. But what was interesting was that once this was, you know, and because they were concerned that it was going to result in the ugliest shoes you could possibly imagine, and it did. But the thing is that those shoes became almost icons within a lot of different you know, cultures, because you could be completely expressive. And it was fun, the fact that Nike has now let me be completely expressive. Obviously this is not something that they're going to create, but it's something obviously that I did. I'm expressing myself, and it's cool, and everyone loved it, no matter how ugly those shoes were. And so I think it's that idea that Nike was willing to give up, and Vans was willing to give up that control and let the consumer express themselves, I think was really the beginning of where we've headed now with the full consumer expression of product. And I think it's great. And I think that's the other side of the story, is that a lot of times people, I think I would say this as a warning to folks, a lot of students, and I know I was this way, They want whatever they're trying to create to be perfect, and they want perfection out of what they're doing. That's as ArtCenter as you can get, right? And I know that a lot of brands want perfection right out of the box. Everything has to be perfect. They have to know, and they have to have complete control over it. There's a saying that I've adopted. Like, I don't have no idea who the original author of it was, but it's something that I enjoy, which is perfection is the enemy of good, which sounds sort of horrible, but which is to say that you will never get anything off the ground and moving forward unless you're willing to start to let it go at the point of it being good. If you try to search for perfection, you'll never achieve it, because that's not achievable, right? Or at least in a lot of cases. And so the work that we've done over the years with 3D product design, the original tools were laughable, they're horrible, but they solved very specific solutions. And so and they were useful for just those solutions. And so if we'd said, no, this doesn't do everything, I can't show glow in the dark patches on my 3D design tools, we never would have gone anywhere. We wouldn't be where we are now. And so it's always, obviously perfection is always wonderful to strive for, but don't let it stop a good idea that's ready, that has its time, or ready to have its time, not make it into the public just because not every single detail can be perfected.
Well, and the ability to make compromises at the right time and the right place with the teams you're working with is critical. So Safir, when you've run into some maybe some tension or some abrasion between what might be a new idea bringing into the corporate environment and a group of people that might be somewhat opposed to that, how have you made the case? How have you shifted your storytelling to non-artists and designers, to the teams that really need to be on board for this type of massive transformational work?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think this is where storytelling comes in. And also, this is where we as designers have an ability that maybe other people with different backgrounds, might not be as versed in, which is the ability to speak to the heart. As designers, we have the capacity to tell a story. By the way, all creatives are storytellers. Whether you choose words or images, or 3D objects, any types of visuals, I think we're all storytellers to a certain degree. And so using that storytelling ability to really start from the reason why we believe as individuals, as human beings, that this idea is worth considering. Going back to that and taking into account your audience. So that story needs to be adapted to the audience, by the way. Otherwise, it's likely going to fail. But understanding, again, going back to the idea of understanding what drives people, what drives the person that you're explaining to, making sure that they realize that you understand where they're coming from, but inviting them to be open to considering where you are coming from. And so speaking to the heart, I think, makes things a lot easier. I think there's a saying, and I'm probably going to butcher it, but speaking to the mind will get you approval, and speaking to the heart will drive action. And I think, as a business leader, as very logical, maybe scientists might come to you and give you the facts and the logical reasoning why this is ultimately this solution or this approach should be considered, but you won't get people to buy into your idea until you really speak to their heart. And so that's I think a skill that is worth working on and developing as designers, and you know, it happens through storytelling.
And just to follow up on that, do you feel like you're telling a different story, a radically different story, or is it versions of the same story with slightly different narrative arcs? Tell us a little bit more about that storytelling for the different audiences within your teams and your collaborative process.
Yeah, fundamentally, it has to be the same message, right? This is not about telling people what they want to hear. It's, you know, you have a message to communicate. And by the way, as a change agent, you're putting yourself out there. You know, you're asking people, you know, to go into a place of discomfort. But you yourself are putting yourself out there because, you know, if things fail, the fingers are pointed at you, right? So you have to have a profound conviction.
They shouldn't be. I mean, you know, that you should be. I mean, sorry to interrupt, but Safir,
Yeah.
but people, you know, brands should be encouraging innovation and failure, but that's a whole different topic we can cover.
Exactly. Yeah. And the good brands, and this is a good point, the good brands will understand that and you know, will prevent that from happening. And we're fortunate to be part of such an organization. But again, you know, even indirectly, you know, you're putting yourself out there. So it's important to have that own that conviction, that internal conviction about what your idea is, and have a strong fundamental message to share. But as you're sharing it with your specific audiences, acknowledge where they come from, acknowledge what matters to them, and just maybe modulate the message. But fundamentally, it needs to be the same message.
Yeah, and to your point, this whole idea of speaking to your audience, you will run into that in so many different ways in organizations. So this was one thing that was very difficult, especially if you have an idea that's related to technology or that crosses over between technology and design, because those two audiences are pretty much about as different as you can possibly get. So, you know, if you're pitching an idea, you're going to need to be speaking to creatives. You're going to need to be speaking to your information technology, IT staff. You're going to need to be talking to financial teams. You're probably going to need to be speaking to merchandisers, who have to, and salespeople. All of those people are and then your product developers. People who actually have to put that product into production. All of those audiences need dramatically different approaches. You need to sell to the designers. You need to speak the language of design, which is probably very easy for the most of the people on this call. You know, the expressiveness, the aesthetic, you know, the passion behind what you're doing. You sit down and you bring that story to your information technology team, and they will laugh you out of the room. You need to be, you know, and so maybe that's bringing in someone to help support you with that story, because they will need to understand the technology, its infrastructure, you know, it's, you know, how it's going to integrate. I mean, all of these really kind of dull things that a lot of creatives just aren't used to. And then the finance people, which will be one of your toughest jobs, because you have to go and build an ROI, which used to be my least favorite acronym, TLA, three-letter acronym, you know, your return on investment, you have to put the numbers behind it. How will this bring a return for the company? And one of the things that you can do, and I've done in the past, is you have to think about how do you justify this innovation. A lot of times that can be you do it through hard metrics. You do it through presumptive metrics. The hard metrics are the things that you can prove. The presumptive metrics, which if it's successful, should return, but you can't necessarily prove it. And then the soft metrics, which is, you know, this is going to be more efficient, or people are going to, you know, like working on it and that kind of thing, or it's, you know, it's going to make people happy, that kind of stuff. But all of those are important, but they're different. But if you're talking to someone in finance, you know, there will be different components of that they'll want to hear. And then, you know, your sales team, how is this going to, how am I going to sell this? How am I going to get people excited? So how am I going to sell it to the consumer? And what is this, what is the story? Not just the story now that I'm selling it internally, but for the salesperson, what's my story going to be for the consumer? And how am I going to get the consumer excited? Because again, if I can't get the consumer excited, you might as well go back to the drawing board. So there's so many layers of, it's people say, great, storytelling, check, we'll get on that. It's not just one type of storytelling, it's multiple types of storytelling.
And what happens when it goes wrong? Like, tell us, and it can be any kind of anecdote of like a presentation internal that failed, that really didn't go well. And what happened?
Well, I'll tell you, one of the, I was actually presenting to Mark Parker, the CEO of Nike, and Charlie Denson, who was at the time the co-brand president. And we got through this really great presentation of these digital tools. And Mark Parker, who's a designer, comes from a design background, super excited, fully engaged, asking all sorts of little itty bitty questions about, what does this do? What does that do? What does this function work? Stuff that you would never expect a CEO to ask. And Charlie Denson, who's very analytical, comes from the finance side, was just sitting there, nodding his head and not saying a word. And so we got all the way through the presentation, and everyone was super excited. And then Charlie looked looked at both of us who were doing this presentation straight in the eye and said, okay, so what's the ask? And neither of us had any idea what we were actually asking for. We didn't know, we didn't have any idea how much money this was going to cost, how much it would take to implement it, and it wasn't that they, ran us out of the room or anything, but it was that, yeah, we weren't prepared for all of the audiences. And so one of the things, Safir knows this, that a lot of times that when he and I are having a discussion around a particular presentation that we're going to be doing, we always ask each other the question, okay, who's our audience? Who are we going to be speaking to? What do they want to know from us before you walk into that room? Because if you don't, you're going to have Charlie Denson sitting there going, what's the ask? And look like you've got egg on your face. So.
So Robbie, to answer your question, first of all, I've never failed.
Of course.
Which shouldn't be a surprise to anybody.
No, I've had my share of failures, and it's. Let me put it this way: when you're presenting something, when you're pitching something, there's a debate, and your audience says, you know what, we don't agree with this. We don't see the benefit. We're not getting it. At least you're learning something from the process. You're getting feedback. To me, the biggest failures are the silent ones, the ones where you think you've made your point, you think you've made an impact, but nothing happens, right? Because not only does nothing happen, but you haven't learned anything from the process. You don't know what went wrong. You don't know. So you have to dig for that. But I think it's important, if you're going to fail, it's important for you to know why that is. What is it that did not land? And ideally have a conversation about it. Whether it's with your audience, if that's still possible, or with someone else that you can run the presentation by. And I've had a number of these instances where unfortunately, I realized I had the sense that my pitch did not land, but I did not know why.
Well, and that is actually one huge difference between doing this work internally and doing it externally, is that there's always another fund to go pitch for money. There's always going to be another potential audience or customer or group of collaborators. And entrepreneurs always talk about hundreds or 200s of pitches, then all these no's and all these no's. In a company, you don't get to have 200 no's. There's just simply not enough time on the calendar. So how have those limited opportunities, how have you prepared, and Joshua, you can maybe respond to this one, is how have you learned from that initial challenging presentation where you didn't have the ask to now being as prepared as you need to be for these types of questions?
I think it really comes down to understanding all of the components. And I don't want to get, I'm trying to think of how to answer this in a way that's not going to put everyone to sleep, because it's quite honestly, it's just about being prepared. There's this one thing that I used to hate, but now I totally understand the value of it. Something called a charter that you create for your product. And it basically goes through all of those things that you think that you need to be prepared for. You know, your goal of the project, you know, of this innovation, the benefit of the innovation, the ever present ROI for the innovation, but even the risks. So what's the risk of what are the risks that you're going to be presented with that you have to be aware of, and for a brand, the other point, the flip side of it, what's the risk for not doing this? If we don't do it, what's going to happen? Sometimes those questions of what's going to happen if we don't do this is just as important of what's our risk to doing it. And it's something that actually Safir, I can't get into the details of it, but it's something that Safir and I are dealing with right now. Is we've got a really cool thing that we're trying to do, and and the legal team is saying, oh, there's a lot of risk if you guys don't get all of this right, and we're having to come back and say, listen, but what's the risk to the brand if we don't get this innovation in front of our teams? We're not going to be able to do X, Y, and Z, and this will lead to less revenue. So while we understand the potential legal risks of if IP is lost, or if we but we actually think the risk to not doing it is more than the risk of doing it and maybe having something fail. And so it's that preparation. And again, back to my friend, and I'm going to name his name, Vince Radistitz. Thanks, Vince, who was the guy who was always poking holes in my problems, or and driving me crazy. Someone who can put together that list of things that you have to think about is gold, and someone that you should always be close to and curate in whatever you're working on.
Yeah, I agree. The topic of risk that you're bringing up is really essential to the conversation, because there's no innovation without risk. If you're not taking any risk, you're not innovating. So very often in organizations, but also personally, innovation comes down to the amount of risk. How innovative you are often comes down to the amount of risk you're willing to take to bring this idea to life. And so this is where you have to be really convincing towards people who will ultimately be writing the checks or dealing with the consequences of failure, right? So, I think doing your homework and showing that you understand both the risk that the organization is taking in supporting your idea, but also understanding the risk that the organization is taking if it doesn't, is really helpful. And again, Joshua mentioned the case which we cannot speak of, but very often those are the conversations that this comes down to. In our case, as I said before, risk is most probably going to be financial. There might be some impact to brand image, yes, possibly. But if you're working in the medical industry, if you're working in some of the industries where life is at stake, risk takes on a completely different shape.
But I would say, I totally agree, Safir. I would say that unfortunately, I believe that the specter of risk has really held industries back immensely, because a lot of large brands, and you look at some of these large brands who have a $20 billion market cap, for instance, and their response is, am I willing to risk my $20 billion company on something that is only going to push us forward, incrementally? And a lot of times the answer is no. But I don't think you get to be a large, 10, $20 billion brand unless you are willing to accept some risk along the way. And I think my favorite example, which, don't worry, Safir, I'm not gonna get back up on my soapbox, is the world of e-commerce. And we have an e-commerce environment which is largely undifferentiated from e-commerce website to e-commerce website. And it's because it was built on one single original idea from Amazon for selling books. We haven't moved away from that. I think my personal opinion is because there's been lots of innovation out there. There's been lots of ideas. There's been really cool, interesting things, but many of the brands that could really change the way that we do business have not been willing to accept the risk to try something wholly new and put their e-commerce website on the line for something that would either A, embarrass them, or B, potentially, A, embarrass them, B, damage their brand, or C, reduce their revenue. So it's, we're definitely at the tipping point, I think, in the world right now, especially with our current world situation, where if you're really going to, you can't just say, oh, it's just e-commerce, I can focus on my brick and mortar, and my expression of my brand can be through brick and mortar. We're going to have to see innovation on e-commerce to differentiate going forward. So for me, fingers crossed.
Yeah, to a certain degree, I would say this current period, this current crisis is forcing many organizations across many different industries to assume a larger risk, because the risk of not acting is even more considerable, And I like I wanted to bring up this this example, Advance. We used to have a few years ago. We initiated this award. We created this award that initially was called the Wipeout Award. I think it has changed name since, but which celebrated failure, but not just gratuitous failure, not gratuitous failure, but failure that we as an organization learn from and turn into a success. And so, that, in my opinion, is the first step in acknowledging that failure is good. Failure is not bad intrinsically, unless you don't learn from it. And celebrating it when you actually are able to learn from it and turn it into a success.
Yeah, there's that idea of dark data, which people have brought up, and that's not necessarily new, but people have been talking about it and this, I think, came from the pharmaceutical industry, where they've had failures in pharmaceutical drugs. They started going back and saying, okay, what can these failures tell us? What is the data behind things that didn't work? Maybe can they solve, if we do some analysis, can they solve problems in other areas where we had we never thought this, we weren't testing it for this particular purpose, but based on the data, we think we can solve problems in other areas. And I think that brands should probably use some of their failures and start analyzing that dark data for, if this isn't going to work to, sell shoes, maybe it would be great for selling backpacks, or, so there's some interesting.
The gray water of business.
Yeah. Gray water of business. Exactly.
Well, and it's abundantly clear from history that, you don't want to be like Kodak, right? That's not, you don't want to invent the digital camera and then not invest in it, right? And see your company fail because you couldn't imagine that future. So we're going to transition. Oh, go on.
But apparently you do want to be like Polaroid, who died a horrible death and now has had a rebirth in the digital world. So, it's shocking how exciting having an actual physical photograph is in the world of people who have grown up only having digital photographs. I don't know. Sorry for that aside. I just
No, I mean the number of weddings that I've been to that have had, you know, Polaroid cameras all over the you know, the space, and people picking them up and taking home pictures is just, it's so innovative.
Yeah, shockingly, who would have thought, you know, paper pictures.
Right. So so we're going to move into the Q&A here, and I know there was maybe some questions raised in the chat. Please bring them into the Q&A and be as succinct as possible. So try to ask the questions in a way that's going to be productive for us to answer, rather than very, very specific. And we'll try to get through them all. I have a first question here from Zara, and her question is, how would you foresee the effects of the financial crisis that many companies are facing right now on innovation within those companies and in those industries?
Great question. I happen to know Zara. Maybe I'll just take the initial stab at this. So as I mentioned before, you know, in terms of taking risks, a lot of organizations are understanding that the crisis that we're facing is forcing us to consider new ways of doing business. You know, we have to innovate, and now is the time to really double down on innovation, and not necessarily just invest in innovation, but really make sure that innovation has a place inside the process. You know, not as an external body that tries to sell ideas to the rest of the organization, but really embedded in the process of bringing product and experiences to life. And you know, when you think about, you know, Joshua, you were mentioning e-commerce. When you're thinking about the impact that not being able to go into a brick and mortar store right now is having on revenue, and what that's doing to e-commerce sales, I see opportunity there, and I think a lot of organizations see it too. I see an opportunity to completely rethink the way we create meaningful shopping experiences for people online. You know, to me, that's the biggest opportunity right there.
How do I do a Zoom high five on that one? That's fine. That's totally with you on that regard. Yeah, I totally agree with Safir. I think it was Intel who originally came up with this idea that when you have an economic downturn, you need to take the goal during those times is to switch all of the resources which you have been using for scale and turn them to innovation, so that when you come out of the economic crisis, you are generations literally ahead of your competitors. And so if you think about it, I mean, it makes total sense, right? If you're in an economic boom, you're probably spending as a company all of your efforts in scaling your business, in expanding and scaling and just trying to grow. When you go into that economic downturn, some companies, especially companies that don't have like a large, what they call war chest of money, you know, they think, oh, we've got to tighten the belts, and so they start laying off people and you know, and scaling back their I have my FedEx delivery right now, this time of day. So anyhow, if you can still hear me with the truck rolling by. So the idea then is that for companies that do have the war chest, is that you take all of those efforts that you've had around scale and you move them to innovation. And then you again take that time to, as you know, Intel has done in the past, leapfrog your competitors and doubly focus on innovation. I think it's a very important lesson. I have a, and it, you know, it's not just for sentimental reasons. I have an aversion to thinking that innovations. This is something that I think is a really good point to bring up in this particular environment. Is that a lot of times when you will bring an innovation to a leadership team, one of their, especially if it has the potential to make things far more efficient, one of their first lines of thinking will be, wow, great, we can use this to reduce costs and reduce headcount, and thus, lay people off or have a reduction in force. To me, layoffs and using an innovation to reduce headcount is the enemy of innovation. If you use an innovation to reduce headcount, you will never get innovation in your organization ever again, because everyone will realize that innovation means reduction in headcount, and I don't want to be part of that. And I've seen that happen at companies, and it makes an extremely difficult environment for anything positive and to move happen, because everyone just wants to keep doing their job the way it is. And so you really have to make, my rule of thumb is that innovation, especially an innovation that produces massive efficiencies, should be used to take that same group of people, move them into this new innovative way of doing things. Because innovation doesn't just need to be, isn't just necessarily a process. I mean, it isn't just a product, it can also be a process, right? Move them into this new way of doing things and use that efficiency now to massively grow your business. And I think that's the mistake that, especially on the CFO side, many companies make around innovation, especially efficiency innovations.
There's this, I think it's Warren Buffett that said, it's when the tide goes out that you see who's been swimming naked. And so, one could argue, and I've been mentioning this quite a bit, but I think it's telling of the time we're living right now, right? The crisis is real. The crisis is here, and organizations that are not that are just on the brink of stability, unfortunately, are not going to survive. That's a reality. We've seen huge companies, go into bankruptcy because they had not taken the appropriate steps to position themselves for agility. And I think a lot of what will contribute to making organizations able to survive this crisis is their ability to pivot, their ability to rethink the way they do things more efficiently. And that doesn't, I totally agree with Joshua, it does not mean that, it does not mean laying off necessarily. Obviously there are circumstances that call for that, but it's about rethinking how we do things and being prepared to make changes and really get to a point where the changing economic environment is something that the organization can respond to and respond to in a specific way, in terms of products, in terms of experiences, in terms of the ways the product is brought to the market and to the consumer, but also in terms of the strong ties that you create with your consumer. Those are the ties that you need to invest in, and the consumers don't care if your company's going through financial hardships. They have a certain expectation from the brand. They expect the brands to be there for them, to be there with them, and the brands owe it to them to make sure they do.
Great. So we have a few more coming in here, so going to try to get through them. So from Ian, and his question is multi-part, so I'll try to read it and then summarize. What is the process and conversation around the following? Going from a pure creative potential technology solution that is emerging to an operational executional idea that starts to gain momentum as an actual piece of the business. How does this play out for you in terms of your work, short, medium, and long-term goals?
Safir, yeah, well, you want to?
So I happen to know Ian.
I was thinking advanced customs would probably be a good. I mean, that was something that you guys had to take from a concept to a full operational, now rather large process.
Yeah, and this is where I think this is where my biggest learnings came from, because as designers and as creatives, you're guided by a vision, right? You're guided by a vision. You're passionate, you're driven, and you're committed to making that vision a reality. You don't always have the tools or the skills to make that happen. And so one of my biggest learnings was understanding what it really took to bring a vision to life. And this is something that I'm reminded of every time I pitch either to myself or to someone else a great idea. It's really to, understanding that it's a lot easier to come up with great ideas, but true innovation, organizations that are truly innovative are actually the organizations that are able to take those ideas, take those great ideas, and then bring them to life. And it involves collaboration. It involves a tight-knit, it does involve process, it involves communication, it involves synergy. All these are things that designers intrinsically are not necessarily used to doing. As a designer, I mean, going through the early terms at ArtCenter, I was used to working on my on my assignments, and then most likely the night before, and then putting my stuff up, and then really comparing what I did to everyone else, and really be inspired and pushed by how much better everyone else's work was. But it was fundamentally a very individualistic approach. Now I think I'm reminded that yes, you need to have great ideas. You need to build a tribe that will help you bring this idea to life.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. If I think back in my own experience, with the move to this fully digital process for bringing product to market, the original vision for this is that it would be a brand new way, at least for the fashion industry, the footwear and apparel industry, to bring product to market, and all the advantages, faster, less expensive, make more money, all of the typical ways. And in the early days, it was, we've got this innovative tool, which is going to be fantastic for us to use. So let's focus on the tool as this innovative component, but realize that, first of all, no one understood how to use it. There wasn't a process built around it, and there wasn't any infrastructure to support it. Okay, so let's go in and let's start building a process. And so I started working from a functional silo. All right, let's make sure that the functional silo, let's say that the designers or the product developers are supported with a process and the tool sets for making this happen. But that was great, but it never left the silo, and it didn't become an end-to-end process. And now we're at the point where really what it started out with, this really innovative way to design product, is now what it means is that the entire business needs to shift. We have to create, the factories have to be onboarded with this new innovative tool set. The fabric and leather mills need to be onboarded with a way to create digitally, which they'd never thought of even probably 5 years ago. Every part of our process needs to be reevaluated for how we do this. And I don't know if I thought that 20 years later, I'd still be working on digitizing the entire go to market process for a retail goods industry. I don't know if I would have. I think I would have probably run screaming. But I mean, the idea is that I'm glad I didn't. It is something that if you're really committed to making a massive innovative change within an industry, it's probably not going to be just a tool or a process. It's going to mean changing the way an entire industry functions, and it's a great feeling, and I think it's what gets Safir and I up every day. But it's not a small task. That's not for the faint of heart.
So
So
our
Ian,
next,
I hope that answers your question, Ian.
our next question here from Jared, and Jared asks, since you are now focused on broader enterprise-wide solutions across VF, what guides your decision-making on how you balance the unique needs of each brand against the economies of scale and the benefits of this work for the organization as a whole?
Yeah,
Good question.
Okay, I'll start with that. So, I haven't been at VF very long. You know, it's what, 7 months now. But I can say that, you know, I've worked with brands that again have or enterprises that have multiple brands. And the one thing that's true that you can say is that, you know, I think VF has an amazing group of brands, but they all have, it's not a but the exciting thing about working with that many brands is that they all very much have their own identity and expression to their consumer, and even passion from their consumer. For, I mean, Vans is people are you know, it's kind of like that Ford versus Chevy thing, you know, like the passion that people have around wearing Vans. You know, it goes, it's you know, it's not just a brand, it's a lifestyle, right? And I think that we as innovators really need to remember that when we're doing something. It's funny, I was watching I think it was a Burberry ad one time, and you know, it was this picture of this little old gentleman with a pencil behind his ear cobbling something in a wood shop with dust falling on the side of you know, the table. And I'm thinking to myself, I know that those things that they're talking about, they're probably made in a factory in China or at least Italy, but it looks nothing like that. You know, it's not that vision of the, you know, the cobbler, you know, at the table with the tweed cobbler. You know, but again, you can't necessarily, even if you're doing something really innovative, especially with like a digital technology, I think there is a friction between digital and brand authenticity that you can't deny and you have to address. It doesn't mean that you can't use digital tools or digital technologies within a brand that has a more traditional face to the consumer, but you have to know how to do it right. Again, it's about knowing your audience. And so I guess my point being is that, you know, if you look at Vans and let's say the North Face is known for being very technical, you know, having a particular outdoorsy side. Their expression of anything that we do for them around innovation is likely going to be very different than what we do for Vans. And even if it's just for one is for apparel, one's footwear. So that's something that I think that both Safir and I keep in mind every single day, is that if we're introducing something, an innovation to a brand, how does it fit? Is it compatible with their brand aesthetic? Or how do we modify our approach so that when we release it to them, it's compatible with their brand aesthetic?
I wanted to jump in also. Thanks, Joshua. But I wanted to jump in and thank Jared specifically for hiring me 16 years ago, advance, and being a friend and a mentor since then. The question is absolutely valid. It's a key question and probably one of the most important ones that I had to ask myself when I transitioned from the brand specifically into the enterprise structure. So moving from inside being you know, inside the Vans brand to supporting to even supporting the brand, but from the outside. But also since then focusing on bringing digital innovation to the enterprise. And you know, my approach to this has been, and I think this is something that we're all aligned on, is that when it comes to the digital transformation of our product creation process, the goal is not to create efficiencies. It's not about saving money. It's not about replacing people, saving headcount. It's about creating better product, right? It's about creating better product and empowering the teams with tools and technologies that allow them to do things that they couldn't do otherwise. And by the way, how we pay for it is through these efficiencies that we gather along the way. But it's important to state the purpose and the mission that we set for ourselves. What that means when we start thinking about enterprise versus brand is that we need to understand the specificities of each one of the teams, the individuals, the teams, and the organization in general, how they work, how they bring product to life. It's not about imposing a process. It's about adapting the technologies that you're creating in order to augment the process. But it's the one-size-fits-all model does not work. We know that. But at the same time, there are economic constraints that force us to make decisions for the whole, with the intent of really taking into account, again, the specificities of each brand. So it's a careful dance. It's not an easy one. Those are not easy conversations, and we're reminded every day that of the importance of that in our conversations with the brands. And so, yeah.
Yeah, and sometimes I think, to your point, Safir, sometimes it's about, a company like a company like VF is about providing as much back-end standardization to get all of those efficiencies and cost savings, but allow the front end and to allow growth and front end expression of the brand identity and the brand authenticity and brand aesthetic, but support that with back-end standardization. That's not in all cases, but I think that's. I mean, if you look at a company like VF, I think that's what we're trying to accomplish.
Myself here. So moving on to the next set of questions, we've got about 7 or 8 more. I'm going to combine 2 together here because I think they're along the same lines. So the 2 questions are: what other recent brand innovations outside of Vans and VF have inspired you? And then if that can be part of the question, or who do you guys follow in the world of innovation that's outside of the network on an individual level?
No one's as cool as VF, so I don't really understand the question.
All right, we can move on.
You got that one. You got this one. You know some amazing folks.
I get inspired. I get inspired by a lot of people, as I think we all do. There are a few people that I think I tend to gravitate towards. From a technology point of view, Peter Diamandis has some theories that are really, really amazing. His understanding of the role of technology in our lives and in making purposeful progress is really impressive. In terms of business, Clayton Christensen, who unfortunately left us a few months ago, is someone that I admire a lot. His theory about the jobs to be done specifically is really inspiring to me. The fact that as a consumer or as a human being, you hire and fire things in your life depending on your needs in the moment. That can be tools, that can be product, and a lot of his theories have also been very inspiring. On the humanitarian side, there's one person I'd like to give a shout out to. She's been really a mentor for me, and it's Wilda Spalding. She's the great granddaughter of the founder of Spalding Sporting Goods, and has been leading this human rights consortium, and she's been very an important part of grounding me in purposeful design and innovation, remembering that there are problems out there that need to be solved beyond just the next cool thing in the market.
So I'll go a bit old school and actually on the ArtCenter brand a bit. One of the people that I would say has been a great influence is Sid Mead. ArtCenter grad, did all of the concept work for Blade Runner, and up to the time of his death recently was doing incredible work. You look back at what he was doing in the 60s in terms of illustration and concept, and it's in some ways, some of the stuff is still beyond what we're currently doing today. And I think if you can have that kind, I think that's the kind of vision, that forward-thinking vision that I would aspire to, that I think people should aspire to. And I'm also a bit of a buff of history, so it's kind of cool to give a nod to someone who's done it, gone before us.
Great, and sad to lose Sid, such an inspiring ArtCenter visionary.
Yeah.
So a question here from Stephen, and I'll read this here. It's regarding skills for creatives to work effectively in corporations that are different or additional to skills required to design firms or as entrepreneurs. So the question is, you mentioned laying out the charter, understanding the motivations of all the silos, doing the ROI, doing the varying storytelling. What other skills are valuable, especially for new creatives in a corporate environment? It's a great question, Steve.
I would say, back to good old Sid, concept storytelling. If you can build out a prototype, a visual prototype, even if it doesn't work, something that shows that vision in a visually compelling way, that's a fantastic skill, and one that a lot of ArtCenter grads have. And I think that's where, especially right out of college, that's a great place to start working with collaborative teams and to be part of that process where you're learning from everyone else, using your skill to be able to provide that communication and visual storytelling.
I'm gonna tweak the question a little bit, take a little bit of a different approach to this, and maybe share a piece of advice that could apply to both cases, but takes on a different aspect, a different form, depending on whether you work internally to a great organization, or independently or in a small team. I think it's important for you to find your voice as a designer, as a creator, right? Find your voice, find your purpose, and find your superpower. Because I think it's important to know your weaknesses, but it's equally important to double down on your strength. This is what makes you unique, and this is what makes you valuable. Inside an organization, obviously, people need to know what they can come to you for, but also as an independent or in a small team. So, if you're able to do that, I think you will be able to connect, and your message, your internal message, the storytelling that you're involved in will resonate a lot more when people know exactly where this is coming from.
Very good. So I think we can let's jump to the next couple, and we're 1 minute over already, but I think we can cover the final group here. So this is a similar question, and maybe Joshua, you can take this. How can a junior designer push for innovation when their team leader is not open to innovative ideas and only focus on maintenance or feature-based work?
Keep the lights on attitude. That's a tough one. I think that if you're in an organization like that and you're trying to push things forward, you can be in a really difficult situation. My thought around that is it always comes back to storytelling. If you simply are pushing against, pushing a rock uphill, with a cool idea within an organization where you don't have people who understand it. You are going to need to be able to produce a compelling story and rally people around you, get people excited. One of the things I've always said, and we were talking about earlier, is that you can have the most compelling idea in the world, but if you can't get people excited about it, you're not going to ever get it off the ground. And I think that's really what it comes down to, is how good of a storyteller can you be? It's something that we call within the industry executive communication. You can even be a good storyteller, but unless you understand how to communicate to executives, use their language, use their perspective, you're going to struggle, I think, to sell ideas, at least past a certain level. So I think that's another thing that I think people straight out of school need to really understand, is that there's going to be an expectation for a certain type of behavior, and a certain way of presenting things: concise, clean, fast, to the point, with clear, supportable ideas and a compelling story that can be done in a short amount of time. And that's a very, very difficult skill, and one that's developed over time. And I think using executive communication skills and storytelling is the key to unlocking some of these things.
Great, and to jump to the next one, Safir, I think this would be great for you. If you were, and this is from Adam, if you were not at VF presently, what are some of the brands or categories that you believe would have a major advantage during the current pandemic and overall crisis that we're going through?
Interesting. I think the biggest opportunity right now in this current situation, and given where we are as a society, lies in education. And I'm not saying this because, you know, this is ArtCenter, and we're talking about this in the context of the great work the college is doing. But in general, I think this is an opportunity. There's a deficit in skills, and this deficit is clear right now, is growing, and at the same time, there's so many people out there who do not have access to quality education. There's so much talent out there that does not have the opportunity that we all have had, right? So I think if I were not at VF, I would probably focus on education and focus on bringing educational opportunities to groups and populations that have not had that chance.
Great. Any additional thoughts, Joshua?
I think Safir said it perfectly. Yeah, absolutely.
And I agree as well. That's why we're all here.
Yeah.
So it's, and to wrap things up now, I think there's a few more questions here, but I think we've addressed them over the course of the conversation. And if not, please get in touch directly via our email and the invitation to make sure we address the question, and I can pass it along to Safir and Joshua if you feel like you haven't had everything answered. So that concludes our webinar. Thank you both for the incredible insights and the candid conversation and real practical advice. I think there's something for everybody to take away here. And it's really great to hear your point of view on all of this. So just a final couple of notes for the audience. We will send a survey after this, as we have done with all of these webinars thus far. We really appreciate your feedback. I know that there's some feedback that has been shared from people that have attended multiple times. We're building that into the next version of how we're going to run these webinars and the bold programming overall. So don't feel like we're not acknowledging you, and just stay tuned for the next round. So that's that. And then everything else can be found on artcenter.edu, and we are very grateful to have had the conversation today. Joshua and Safir, thank you for your time. Please let me know what we can do to help your work. I know we have a great relationship, but there's always more that can be done. So
thank you, Rowan. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Thank you. So with that, we'll end the webinar, and we will see you the next time in this box at this current juncture.
Take care.
Take care.